Truth can only be expressed through lies. Paradoxes are a good lens for the films of Bruno Dumont. He shows us humanity in a film about rape and murder. He shows us tenderness in films about bullying and bravado. He uses sci-fi, surrealism and slapstick to shed light on quotidian rural life in northern France. Dumont's figures are outsiders, idiosyncratic, neurodivergent perhaps, twitching and gurning through indifferent muddy landscapes. Not the picture postcard view of northern France, but not kitchen sink realism either, a sort of ethereal banality. But there's a twist in this tale. Last year, Dumont cast Léa Seydoux and the city of Paris in a glamorous State of the Nation satire, simply entitled France. Nothing in Dumont's filmography prepares us for this dérive away from the scrubland into the centre-ville of media and power. And yet, with the Prince of Paradoxes, we are trained to expect the unexpected. You're listening to Moob Tube, the Cahiers de Cinema for the Letterboxd generation. I'm joined by two Bruno boys, two Bruno bros, my regular co-host Owen and friend of the show George MacBeth, who last joined us all the way from Germany to discuss Alexander Kluge. He's now here in the studio with us. George, what was your first date with Dumont and what made you stick around?
L'Humanité, and I rewatched it. I finished it and woke up in the morning and rewatched it, and then the binge began.
Right.
And then I binged for a week or so, but I probably need to revisit once more, I think, Humanité. But yeah, that was the starter.
What was your first impression of Humanité? Because it's quite a restrained, brutal affair.
Just totally puzzled. It was like a completely just maddeningly like enigmatic in lots of ways. Like I couldn't really figure out. Initially, I think I succumbed to what you felt, which is that I thought this was a kind of kitchen sink, grim. I thought it was the Dardenne brothers, basically.
The sort of moralising the lessons of Dardenne.
Yeah, and then of course you search and you can't see the lessons because they aren't there, and you can't see the politics because that's not the terrain in which the film is.
Even when it depicts like workers going on a strike, there's a curious indifference to it all.
I forgot about that. Yeah.
But there was a weird familiarity as well. There was something about particularly the environment, the like landscapes, the compositions of the shots. Everything suddenly felt like, familiar. Like I've walked around these films beforehand.
Owen, we last spoke about Dumont on this podcast
last year.
Over a year ago now.
Which was our first onboarding to the kind of muddy, bloody.
It was on Movie back when we were doing a podcast exclusively about movie films, and my reaction was mixed. I think I could see some virtue in it, but I was alienated either by the austerity of it or by a kind of distaste with just the lack of attractive people. I think I remember describing everyone in the cast as being a solid 4.
True.
And yet his films are a solid 10 out of 10.
Exactly, but that was not a conclusion
Dumont
I came to initially.
Is like a 9. He's like a kind of handsome.
What about Farron's neighbour? She's alright.
Farron's neighbour. She's hot in like a kind of sloppy. The best.
This is not what we came here to discuss.
No, it's not. Can I first of all say that it's a sunny, bright day in London. It's a privilege to be here in Bar Story in Peckham. We're recording live. It's pretty empty in here, actually.
How's everyone gone?
Yeah. You mentioned kitchen sink realism, actually, and it's impossible to escape the kind of gravitational pull of making that kind of defining. In terms of genre, Bruno Dumont is kind of this realist, this kind of grimy, grim, not grimy, quite clean realist. I like to think of him as more like baptismal font realism. That's where I'm going.
Can you say a bit more about that?
I can say a bit more because, like, again, you mentioned austerity. His films are quite remarkable in what they don't show. One thing we can talk about is the presence of the divine. And the sublime in all of his films. So even there is that's why you can't kind of the kind of Shane Meadows films or whatever, the kind of kitchen sink realism. That is all there is. The world.
Well, there's a pretense to the real. I mean, I think
but here it escapes. The trajectory launches off. There is this unspoken, indefined, intangible otherness around his films, which sometimes characters glimpse, sometimes it kind of penetrates the film itself. Like you get real moments of like sci-fi, what you might call, you know, if you were a simpleton and you were religious, you'd probably call like a miracle. Right, you know, there are moments of miracles.
If you're a religious and a simpleton, all right, Richard Dawkins.
All right, but they are. No, but they are
tuned into the humanist hour.
But they are. There are moments where, and then they don't happen very often. You know, in we can talk about loads and loads of examples in Concon. You know, the first series of Concon.
But they shouldn't happen very often, right? In order
they
to
should.
Yeah, miracles almost by definition are quite unusual.
Infrequent, unusual. It might just be the kid, the Spider-Man, who jumps on the wall and sticks there.
Fuck, I forgot about
incredible
Spider-Man.
moment.
Oh
and that's the only part in that film that really escapes the real. But that's enough to kind of suddenly.
No, I mean, there's loads of stuff escape. Well, no, actually, yeah, that's
in
the sequel. In the sequel,
but in Concon, the first season. That's this one singular moment where the unreal, like the door kind of opens a little bit wider and you get this glimpse of this kind of surreal otherness.
But it's also the slippage is like, it can also, I mean, it's a bit like a dialectical image, you know, it's both in one place and in the other at the same time. And each one of his behaves this way. Like, so the other one that I had in mind as one of these moments of the miraculous that makes you doubt whether or not you've seen what you think you've seen, which is the levitation in the allotment at the end of Humanity. And that was one of the ones where that prompted me to rewatch it after I'd watched it for the first time in the morning after.
I think I'd like to later on we'll talk in more depth about Concon and the structure of it and how it situates into Dumont's filmography. But just to come back to your point about realism and obviously, like, we don't want to dwell too much on it, but a lot of the engagement from Britain with Dumont's filmography is projecting Britain's complicated, unfortunately uncomplicated relationship to realism. I think, you know, British filmmaking's original sin is this pretense to be able to depict the real through direct techniques, and I think even Alan Clarke, who is my favourite British filmmaker and is kind of unfairly boxed in with realism, he still has this sort of dogmatism about in Elephant, wanting to show the violence, wanting to sort of show. Dumont doesn't do that. You know, he really avoids moralizing or using film as a vehicle for anything other than sort of just kind of. But that's depicting.
Also, I mean, it's because of the relationship to an understanding of omission and lacuna and what's not shown, right? And I understood this a bit better because that's part of what gives the films the enigmatic quality, and it's not done through kind of like strange temporal leaps or changes in location. We never changed location. We were always in the same fucking grim.
Apart from maybe Flanders.
True.
Notable exception, really.
But in this interview where he's talking about how he basically sculpts the film's form through a process of extraction, and so very often scenes are just rerun in kind of 17 or 18 different confabulations of the same basic thing. Subsequently, he will rearrange these, and that's how the form emerges.
Yeah, and because they can appear often, you talk about linearity, you know, time, they can appear kind of like a series of disconnected moments that kind of together congeal around a whole. Like Roi Satan is a really good example of this, because there is a kind of recursive looping plot in a way. There is a narrative there about this Satan-like figure and this young girl who he kind of befriends. There is a murder of her father. There are moments of redemption and violence, but lots of the scenes are them just walking from place to place. You know, Dumont, there's the classic Dumont shot, these anamorphic lenses.
People walking up a long lane.
People walking into a farm, arriving at a farmhouse and are going through a door. There's these moments of continued arrival, and it's you might assume that they're kind of happening. They are happening in a sorry, COVID. They are happening in a kind of linear way. There's no reason to doubt that they're not linear in any sense, but this episodic kind of fragmentary nature kind of helps to sustain unreality, because, you know, they are very ordinary films, but, you know, we rarely see people doing ordinary things. Like everything that is kind of banal is also extraordinary.
That's true, actually. There's no fixation on like
cooking or
exactly. There's
drinking a glass of water.
Domestic routines, or and despite all the farm scenery, we never actually see anyone
inside the
tilling
house.
the land, or
no
anything that could be
really.
confused for a kind of like idealization of rural life or rustic existence.
Well, we see people moving from place to place. There's a huge amount of like kinetic energy happening in his films, but not much. One of the key motifs of his films is like fast cars. Is lads on mopeds, bicycles, sports cars tearing around, and what they're doing is they're moving with an enormous amount of explosive energy, but they're not going anywhere. They're going across a field to go to another farmhouse. They're suddenly motivated by this huge explosion of kind of, you might call it like sublimated rage or something, but they're not going anywhere. They're just they might drive to a bit of Calais, they might drive to a tunnel, they might drive to another bit of field that's broadly identical to the bit of field they just left. They're kind of directionless in a way.
And all the characters inhabit the same world ultimately.
Yeah.
Like, so Ralph, you said at the top that France seems to be out on a limb which has not got a precedent, but there is that amazing moment when Léa Seydoux' character, she arrives in some godforsaken bit of Normandy to investigate a story when her career is finally back on track, and she does this moment of faux sincerity next to
but she is a tourist in Dumont's fields.
Exactly. But she it's like exactly
paying lip service.
She's a kind of
returning
she's a visitor. She thinks she's an angelic kind of visitor. But I suppose the film France is such a strange one, because France does suggest a moral clarity more so. It like The Square, by Ruben Östlund. It taps into a kind of an idea of liberal complacency or guilt and class. It plows those fields much more.
That's what made
strongly.
it a bit flat-footed for me. I felt that he was less confident of his own instincts in these areas. So like one of the statements that I did find quite opposite from this interview we saw with him is when he says, like, as sociology, my films are false.
Right. What he means is that they shouldn't be used as a sociological tool.
Lens,
So when they see, like, the main character in La Vie de Jesus being racist or something, people shouldn't say, this is very interesting because, the rise of the far right, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah, it's actually more a question about that character's kind of moral complexity and their own ambiguity as a character, because like I said, we were chatting the other day and saying, he wants us desperately to empathize in complicated ways with his characters, but he makes it, for the kind of hand-wringing liberal, as it were, he makes it very difficult for them to do that. And one of the complaints people made about Cancan and Coin were, I don't know where the source was, but I think one of you mentioned it. People were like, this is really, really great. I love it. It's very funny and it's, very beautiful. But why does everyone have to be so racist?
Exactly,
And it's kind of, they're reflecting, that's the kind of surface reality of this part of Normandy and Flanders, is that people are pretty racist. And we're not supposed to remark on that any more than that everyone seems to have a clapped up Renault that they drive around in. It's just part of the furniture, and it's not a kind of lever to crack open the skulls of these people. We're not really being invited to do that.
That's in a way what's most striking in Flanders. I mean, I watched Flanders last night and we talked about it a bit in the chat, and like, like even the gang rape scene or various scenes where they just shoot children in the head. Where this is in Flanders, Flanders cuts between scenes from the place Flanders, where it's set in the early 21st century. There's a war going on in the Middle East that the men in this village go off to fight, and while they're out fighting, they commit various warlike atrocities and have warlike atrocities committed upon them, and it kind of pushes to its extreme how much that indifference can be born. Because, I mean, you said earlier, Owen, about Hors Satan. The title is Outside Satan, right? If I'm not mistaken. And yet you described him as a Satan-like figure. We've had interesting disagreements, especially in the Humanity episode, where I very mistakenly thought, well, I mean, there is a shot at the end, spoiler alert, where Pharaon has handcuffs around him at the very end. Yep. He sort of sat where the Joseph, who we assume is the killer, was sat. It's kind of ambiguous whether this is like some kind of attempt to show like the full the full process by which Farhan attempts to try and identify with the darkness,
with suffering,
or whether it's some kind of coy idea that he actually did it. But I'm on the second viewing, I'm not at all convinced of that. But it is interesting that Dumont invites and then rejects this kind of idea of moral judgment, and I think especially in Flanders, just because the behavior of the characters is so much more extreme.
But that's the film when people talk about Dumont as this kind of god of grimness and all this stuff. I think that's the film they're specifically thinking about. I think they're thinking about a lot of his films, but I think they're actually they're correct. For once, they're correct. Yeah, they're correct
in identifying it.
But he makes real pains to to remove any kind of immediate geopolitical context. Because the war they're fighting isn't one of France's wars. It's not Iraq. It's not Afghanistan, where France were minimally involved, if at all, and it's not North Africa. It's completely abstracted away from any real conflict.
It's somewhere in the Levant, and it does have geopolitical.
And it's also lost in time because they're on horseback and they have their packs and their provisions are not,
Yeah, then it's not like
in camo, I think, or they're in like.
Yeah, but in 2006, very obviously you would. There is a context there.
Course, maybe, but I think he's aware of that context and is doing everything he can. It's not Jarhead, and he's doing everything he can to kind of disarticulate that easy assumption, going, "Oh, this is about American interventionism."
What difference would it make if he articulated? What difference would it make if there was a sign saying Iraq at the beginning? Like, what difference would that really make?
Because again, that would invite these kind of too easy. Like sociological lenses on what he's saying.
They wouldn't have to invite
I think you basically need to to achieve what he's seeking to do, which by his own admission I think is sort of philosophizing in film, or like
pretty much,
right. These sort of but not philosophizing in the sense of making arguments, in the sense of just exploring ideas and kind of prismatically or almost in a cubist way, kind of like fragmenting this one idea, let's say, of humanity, I suppose, would be of empathy itself, right? And of like, to do that, you need to remove a certain measure of determinacy. And people think because of the insistence on the location that they're local films, but and that's precisely like what I find so inviting about them, is that they don't think that to achieve abstraction or to like achieve a certain measure of clarity of ideas and that you need to reduce the specificity of the image. In fact, you increase it. And they're very densely in a place that people entirely belong to, and we know this. He casts them from like local welfare centres and like
literally picks people up. He kind of
finds finds retarded.
He just knocked on the door to get Freddie from VIE De Jesus. He just knocked on a door, a random door, and he opened it.
And he's like, "Yeah, you're the
one."
Because I think you're right there. He's zooming in so closely that you achieve abstraction through a very like macro lens. And I think. This isn't Andrew Zalowski doing on the Silver Globe and taking the action to a whole other planet in order to explore humanity and questions of kind of, fate and all these kind of broader philosophical investigations. He's not doing that. He's saying, okay, this is the context. He knows the context really well, so he can kind of comfortably probe its nuances. He knows these people, he knows the accents, and that enables him to kind of disfigure it and introduce these moments of sublimity that creep in all of his films. Like you mentioned, the levitation is something that enters, and even his kind of, I suppose, his most goofy and fun film, Slack Bay, levitation plays a really central role in that. The end literally has a kind of like Fellini-esque moment where the chief investigator, this huge balloon of a man, literally floats down the beach.
It's very Tintin, this one, I think.
Truly,
this is his most Tintin film. I mean, his comic ones verge towards the Tintin anyway, I think. But this is really overdetermined.
There is always some element of like transcendence or like aberration from the real.
Yeah.
In all, maybe not in VIE De Jesus. What happens in VIE? I mean, it's lots of different dimensions. That one. Like in Hors Satan is like probably maybe his most spiritual film in a way. Or like
no, VIE De Jesus
like the
has
bit where she's crossing. She's like he gets this woman to cross this like tiny little narrow strip of.
I find this a bit of
Which is like a bit like nostalgia with a
Yeah,
candle.
exactly.
Almost.
There's also the field
Tarkovsky
that
homage,
explodes into flame, which he
Amazing
implies he
scene,
then
phenomenal.
and it implies he stops the burning.
Yeah,
And it's kind of divine act. But I think as well, La Vie de Jesus, talk about that, that's probably his one that's most rooted in the real. It's also his first film. There are moments, and for him it's characters looking at, which is again a motif, characters looking at the sky. And, at the very end of the film, he lays back in the grass and he's staring at the sky. And those are moments, he's showing you they're seeing something, but when we're seeing them see something. That explains so much of his films. Like people seeing something that is just hidden,
in the same way that Pharaoh
somewhere.
sees something when the Eurostar goes by and
He screams at it, or in the market garden, in the allotment, when he kind of stands in the middle of the allotment and is just staring out across the fields. There are these moments when they're connecting with something. Satan, it's when Satan, as it were, if he's Satan, prays or seems to pray before these huge blank landscapes.
And in Heidewisch, when the final scene when she kind of goes after a period of kind of like endless religious anxieties and twists and turns, decides to knock herself off in a pond, and just at the point when the bubbles have stopped surfacing to the water, the character that will become the main protagonist of Satan is who we've only seen
the guy they call him.
Yeah,
the guy. Yeah.
He just fishes her out of the water, and we get a close-up of him, and then of course he becomes. Actually, I've noticed this.
That's sort of same character, basically.
Yeah.
Yeah, but this is how he links the films together. It's almost like Pelagian, like because
Pharaon in Humanité
exactly comes from the end of Levit. Yeah, and they thread together and into this one.
Oh, is Pharaon in La Vie de Jesus?
No, but he was inspired by
the
the
actor
inspector
who was,
and
then he said he wouldn't do it because his wife would leave him. Yeah.
But I think you're right. This is a persistent universe where you might say that like the Newtonian rules or laws that govern his world apply equally across all his films. This is the same time, even his films that kind of like, when we're glimpsing into the past, with Jeanette or with Slack Bay, which is like set in 1910, we feel like we're just in an earlier iteration of this world. We don't feel like it's a separate. So he's constantly,
definitely with Slack Bay, because you can see him warming up for Concon.
Yeah, because the two detectives who are these buffoonish kind of Clouseau-like characters are literally the two detectives we then kind of see in which speaks to a kind of, because we have these like inefficient detectives. I don't think he's commenting on the kind of absurdity of state
contemporary gendarme.
He's not saying that at all. But he is commenting perhaps on the kind of absurdity. It's not ACAB, no. But he might be commenting on the absurdity of
discuss.
Live on the Vara.
There we go.
But his like anti-institutional and his distrust of kind of.
Is he anti-institutional?
I think he is in a way, because
he definitely is. Like Heidewisch, the whole thrust of it is basically that this girl is kind of frumpy. What do you call it when somebody is in training to become a nun?
Well, you said it anyway.
Anyway, but she's thrown out of the nunnery because of the fervor, the kind of intensity, the like Kierkegaardian.
She believes too much.
She believes too much, and there's seen to be a kind of like pride or a narcissism in her devotion. And so then, of course, her zealotry leads her into one of Dumont's classic kind of odd couplings, because she's the daughter of like a rich Parisian, and she ends up with this zealous young guy from the Banlieues. But there the anti-institutional thrust is, of course, that the church could not accommodate a relation to God such as she wants to have, and a love that she is kind of purporting to achieve. So it's all based on this 13th century mystics, Heidewisch's ideas about love.
It's anti-dogmatic.
Absolutely, yeah.
But exactly in that sense, I sort of think anti-institution doesn't quite do it justice, because it's more just like it's reconciled to the fact that people will fail to assimilate into institutions, but also a recognition that institutions will fail to adapt.
Or also that, something like God or divinity, the divine can't be encapsulated by, it's like this Lavinian thing almost, it can't be contained by something as human as the church, or as, and I think one of the touchstones for say Jeanette, which is his musical story of Joan of Arc, or the childhood of Joan of Arc. The source material for all
His
that was
Tommy.
the source material for that was a play written by Charles Piguet, who was a French mystic theologian, who had a very complicated relationship with the Catholic Church because he was kind of he wasn't really permitted access to it, and was very critical of the excesses of the Catholic Church. He was anti-dogmatic. He had a kind of natural of the land Proudhonian kind of socialist Catholicism, basically. That is the literal source material for Jeanette. And there's lots of things when you look through Piguet's writing that really resonate with the world that Dumont is building. He said that the sinner is at the heart of Christianity, of belief. Like his belief in the sinner as the essential thing that throws belief into relief is the sinner and sin. And he also said that everything begins in mysticism and ends in politics. And I feel like kind of Dumont is tracking the same thing, and maybe he's inverting it in a way, and he's taking those things that are political.
Mysticism.
Yeah, he's returning it. So everything, all these things, all these little touches which are political, which is the migrant crisis,
People going on strike, which is like politics in a broad sense, like day-to-day life, the kind of Front National, all this stuff.
Well, race relations.
He doesn't really get there with France
struggle
in that respect.
No.
Because France stays in the discourse somewhat.
Yeah. And this is why I feel that
mysticism to discourse. Back to
Yeah.
this is
Yeah,
it's the train with the diagram we're drawing.
But I also felt he didn't know what to do with Paris as a character
city.
in his
He
film.
didn't know how to shoot Paris.
He didn't know, and
it's very touristic, yeah.
And in Height of Which,
Shots the
this is
Champs-Élysées
manifest
everywhere.
because that's his only other film set in Paris. And he deliberately kind of shoots it as though he was shooting in Lyon or like some other minor French city. Like you never see the Eiffel Tower. You don't see anything of any distinction.
In France?
No, in Height of Which.
Oh, when he goes, yeah.
I think,
whereas in France, it's very. I mean, it's every. That's, as I said in my intro. It's capital everything. It's it's a capital. Leading lady, literally a Bond girl. The capital city, one of the most famous cities in the world, in full. Champs-Élysées postcard regalia, and media and power as the kind of main topic.
And
it's such a departure from his usual palette.
We sometimes glimpse those things. There's a journalist in Coin who occasionally rocks up, but she's dismissed very quickly. You get these little expressions of institutions and power. You get the mayor, but the mayor's pretty ineffectual. You've obviously got the detectives who are a representation of kind of the state, but they're ineffectual. It's funny that the police station, so the gendarme station in Coin is the restaurant in Concon. It's the same building.
Oh, yeah.
And it might have just been a quirk of location scatting, but I kind of like the idea that this kind of gendarme station is kind of just kind of floats around. It's just occasionally inhabits one space and then another. It's kind of it seems kind of like it's odd not to recognize that building because it's quite a identifiable seafront property. So
let's zoom out here a bit, because Dumont's career is, some film careers are very short and there's only really one period available, and other careers, like Godard's kind of veer this way and that way. Looking at Dumont's career, he starts off teaching philosophy and working as a videographer for, I don't know if it's a government or a university, but essentially doing videography of buildings, quite boring image capture.
Industrial film.
Yeah, industrial film, exactly. And he says that through just standing with a tripod and a camera, waiting for to capture enough footage of a certain thing, he developed this ability to sort of film things in this not neutral way, but the kind of
to make boring things.
To make boring things, exactly. Yeah. Then he makes La Vie de Jesus and Humanité, which feel very much of a piece. He does 29 Palms, which we haven't talked about because I guess we haven't seen it.
I've seen it. It's a bit of a mess. Okay. I think it's an anomaly.
Yeah. And then, so his films gradually develop more and more of a sort of spiritual, immanent possibility in them and manifest these kind of unusual, transcendent moments. That kind of comes to a head with Horse Satan, which is in its own way like a mystic parable. And
well, the crisis really happens with the next one with Camille Claudel.
with Camille Claudel, which
The Juliette Binoche.
It's a
Juliette
breakdown
Binoche.
film. This is a cry for help.
you have to break down to
It's
rebuild.
Binocheification as cry for help, basically. Like,
So this is the sort of film he's received enough art house success that, like, you know, many people work with Swinton now. He worked with Binoche,
Should've beat that
a
out.
better actor than Swinton, but still someone capable of you know.
She's still an actor. I mean, that's the thing, because in that interview, that masterclass he did in London, one of the things he says is that I don't work with non-professional actors because I can't direct them, and he prefers to
Professional actors, you mean?
Professional actors, yeah. So
Yeah.
he prefers to work with non-professional actors, people he finds, partly because he can direct them and their responses are more real. And then he makes this decision with Camille Claudel, with Slack Bay, and now with
Mhm.
France, to start working with professional actors.
But in between that, Concon happens. I just for the listeners, I want to outline Concon. Concon is like, it's 2 times 4 50-minute episodes. The first season is a murder mystery, basically based on finding the chopped up bits of someone's body, someone's headless body inside a cow, and these 2 kind of bumbling detectives in a French village wandering around interviewing people, talking to people. Gradually more murders start happening, various suspects get eliminated.
there's also a kind of Stranger Things style group of children who are better, you know, more clued
attuned
into
to what's going on. Exactly. It's almost Midwich Cookies vibe. And then that sort of has, it's not a spoiler to say that the central MacGuffin mystery is left unresolved. Season 2, 4 years later, so many of the actors have visibly aged, shows it has this sci-fi theme where various globules of
gunk,
of cosmic gunk
Cosmic
kind
spunk.
of just like jizz onto the earth and create
Apocalypse.
exactly and create
God of
these
the air. We'll get that out of our systems now.
exactly. So that and you have this whisper of and we'll talk about the Twin Peaks comparison very soon, but you have there's a whisper in the kind of the car that's driving on its side a lot in the first and the absurdity of the cow murders. You have these whispers of absurdity and surrealism and the supernatural, and then it comes in full force in Coin and the Extra Humans, which is the second season, which is like that whole world turned inside out through this kind of cloning device that happens to various characters.
Yeah,
phenomenal.
God, it's so phenomenal. It's so good.
It's so
amazing.
fucking good. It's a really good, I think, door or portal for people to get into Dumont.
Is it? Do you think?
I think. I kind of like when I've Dumont pilled people. I've opened with
I
like
think so.
with Concon, because it's shot like a television drama. It's a little bit slow, I suppose, and doesn't have the usual beat, but it has the procedural elements of what a cop, like Nordic cop show is, right?
But it really leads people up the garden path.
It does, because it's never resolved, as you say, because the police are not really well-meaning and they're completely ineffectual, and there is no, often one of the kind of structural elements of these procedurals is they do give us a glimpse of the murderer. We get to see a little bit of them and their motivations, and hear the external, which is either the person who's killing people and stuffing them in cows, or is this extraterrestrial force. It's completely motiveless. It's like H.G. Wells, isn't it? Like this alien force making its plans against us. Yeah. And so we don't have any. All we have is this kind of the world as it is of this investigation that's going nowhere. But it has all of the comedic beats, like the car kind of like driving on its side, which is very, very funny. And it has these kind of this real slapstick energy. The characters are exaggerated, have strange verbal tics. The dialogue is kind of frustrating, but amusingly frustrating. It has all of the.
Everything is the logic of the tic kind of comes to dominate everything, like facial tics, verbal tics.
So many of the actors have
gags become tics themselves, and things spread virally throughout the whole cast, and
like being murdered is sort of viral. Being cloned is viral. Like various things.
Everyone gets a clune.
Everything kind of becomes, and the actor, the main actor who plays the detective Van der Weyden, becomes he just becomes more and more fascinating as the series goes on. You become more transfixed by his strange his tics, his expressions, his
also
kind
his
of surprise.
tautologous kind of like responses to things, like the rules are the rules.
Yeah.
And he's constantly like he will be confronted by something which is truly extraordinary, and he'll just kind of these kind of sounds like a balloon, and he will just make these statements about kind of he's obsessed with the even while they're like driving on two wheels down the road in a police car, he'll stop some kids on bikes going, what about the rules of the road, gendarme national, and he'll kind of like
Gendarme national.
He'll kind of ejaculate with these kind of stock phrases. He doesn't have much depth of dialogue. He often repeats the same things again and again and again.
But there are also tremendous moments when, like, his kind of this ridiculous concatenation of basically glitches and eruptions and ejaculations is seen from the outside, and so we see him at one of the meetings in the village, and we see the kind of aloofness and the coldness with which he's treated by the others around him.
The veterans.
Yeah, the veterans, exactly. Yeah. And he becomes to seem this kind of outwardly ridiculous figure. And these sorts of parallax view shifts he does do occasionally, but he never in a way that cheapens it, I think.
No.
He is also incredible as a director at depicting interiority. And I do think that is perhaps a through line from Humanité, well, from his first film, but notably Humanité, the scene where he gets in the car having seen the dead body of the child and switches on, on the car radio, and this harpsichord piece plays, and then he stops the radio and drives off. And you just follow his the slight movements in his neck. I mean, this is why people compare him to Bresson.
The observation
it may be
body.
erroneous to an extent, but there is something they share, a very good thing they share as directors.
I think he's ultimately a better caster, because I think
they're more memorable people.
Bresson tried to do what or professed to do what Dumont is actually doing with his kind of non-professional anti-theatrical acting.
Yeah, I mean, he spends an enormous amount of time searching for the right face, and when the films don't quite come off, I think, like Flanders, which as good as it is, I think it's clearly falls short of L'Humanité and VIE De Jesus, because of
the main guy, he thinks a bit dead.
Yeah, I think the extremity is the menace is this too much brooding, and there's
but they don't. I mean, one of the things about his characters as well, you mentioned interiority. He's great at showing interiority through corporeality and through a body and its expressions and its tics. What people don't tell us is how they feel. No one ever expresses that they are sad or angry. We see these kind of sublimated explosions of their feelings. So Rosatan, the girl, speaks very, very, very little in the film. It emerges that she's been abused by her father, and the figure Lagarde murders. He takes revenge, as it were, and kills the father with a shotgun, blows him away, which kind of binds her more closely to him, because in a way he saved her. But at no point does she ask him to do this. It's just accepted. She's hovering at his shoulder. There's no kind of exchange or deal made. Whereas someone with Bresson, Diver Country Priest is great at showing us the trembling, the overwhelming spiritual angst of the priest. But we also get him writing in his diary, which kind of it gives us too much almost.
That's true. That's always something I've struggled with Diver Country Priest, actually, is like the diary.
Because it's like
Just
we already get it. We already get that he's feeling spiritually
I haven't
anguished.
seen that film for a while, so I should
we know this from the potato peeling scene. Like, we don't also need to see.
And it's that's him eating his little sad meals of bread and wine. That tells us everything we need to know.
There are moments of deep brevity where someone says, like the bit where in Flanders, which I do very much like, where he's finished telling the story of what happened when he was at war, which we don't need to be told because we see it. But then when he finishes it, we just see the end of the scene where he's talking to his love, the friend of his love, the woman he's in love with, and he just says it was hell there, and he doesn't, he's completely expressionless, but he just says that. And moments like that, I think, are very powerful, and that's something, that restraint, whether it's a restraint of like, sometimes it will be someone screaming.
It's economy
and not saying anything.
Restraint.
But it's an understanding of the balance of these things in terms of what will conjure the most I mean, it's most startling, I guess, in Flanders, where the rapist is identified by the people in the desert. There's this gang rape that's been happened. The woman who's raped identifies. They're recaptured by the people they were occupying, and they identify the rapist. They take him. You just hear him screaming, and it's left to your imagination. The mutilations they're enacting on them. This interiority is and this kind of conscience that's enabled. That is a through line that goes through to France. We do see a lot of Léa Seydoux processing, much in the same way as other actors do, I think, even though she's very, very trained and used to different kinds of directing techniques. You do see her process very movingly, I think, the various kind of changes in her life brought about by, her own kind of complacency, irresponsibility.
Yeah, her own. There are moments of almost silent contemplation in the film. Not many, because it's much more dialogue. It's much more discursive and talky, than his other films. And people are better able to articulate and contextualize their feelings and what's happening to them, which doesn't really happen in, his other films. It's hell is enough. He doesn't have to kind of talk about abjection and war, and doesn't have to situate any kind of philosophical language. Even with, it's moments of unspoken empathy, even if those bits of empathy fall short. I mean, in L'Humanité, when Pharaon is the descendant of a famous kind of regional painter, and he donates a painting to the museum, and when the painting's put there, kind of act of institutional gifting, which the kind of curator, as it were, probably finds relatively normal, he contemplates this painting for a great long time. He looks at this painting and really observes it, and that kind of gives you an insight into his inner complexity in a way that
is one of the great guy in a gallery scenes. I mean, it's up there with John Jost.
All of Vermeers in New York.
Exactly. Yeah,
that's true. It did remind me of that, actually, framing wise.
Totally.
Yeah. So there are these. Yeah, he's really economical in terms of showing us all this depth without actually having to say it. In the same way, he's good at showing us the divine without having to show us God.
Part of the problem you face in that context is that most of the films up until France are people who don't typically analyze themselves. They're not, New York neurotics. They're not people who go to therapy.
Well, and this is where the line of critique comes in.
And in France, there's literally, when you're trying to create that noise that happens when people process whatever they're processing, it's not the sound of a threshing machine or someone screaming. It's someone going on a chat show and talking about their trauma.
Well, it's hard to deal with inarticulacy when your main character is somebody whose entire profession is their articulacy.
Exactly.
And she's pretty much the first. Is she she's the first hyper-articulate protagonist he ever had, and I think that's part of what he struggled with.
But do you not feel that some of the, I mean, is it possible, do you think, to go for a Dumontian approach with people who post on Instagram?
Are you asking whether you can make a Dumont style film about the middle class?
Yeah, and specifically the metropolitan middle class, specifically people who have already narrativized their lives, have already decided, this is my story, this is what happened, I knocked over this Arab guy in the road, and now I'm feeling this, I'm going to donate this money.
What Ralph is referring to there, sorry to cut in, is one of the kind of early moments of France is she knocks his delivery driver off his moped. He then is sufficiently disabled that he can't work for a few months and will suffer a loss of income. So not only just apologising, she feels particularly she owes a debt of an awkward gratitude to this family, so ends up giving them a lot of money and visiting them repeatedly.
But him and his family are inarticulate and are depicted in a very typical Dumontian way. But she is very.
But he's the best character in the whole film. I mean, it's when she goes around to do this kind of secret millionaire style act of penitence. The guy who she knocked over, he's on the sofa throughout the whole scene with his headphones on, listening to music. And I really feel he's the only director who could I don't know, stage this scene like that.
Yeah, I wondered about that, and I was like, has he got quite severe learning difficulties or something, or was he just kind of indifferent about probably knowing Dumont.
But I think also they are they don't feel
he's on the payroll of a clinic, and he gives everybody a job.
they don't feel that the family and Baptiste, the guy, don't feel they don't feel like part of the same contract. They're not opportunistic either, but they just, when she starts, visiting a lot and hand-wringing herself and trying to donate money, they don't really understand that response because it's a different.
They're befuddled.
They're befuddled by her guilt and her angst.
As are the people in
and her way of articulating herself, which is very kind of.
I think that's the main fault line. Then I think we got to it. Like articulacy is where he situates the class differences in his films. Like in Maloot, for instance.
Is that Slack Bay?
Slack Bay, yeah.
The cannibal sailor boy.
Yeah. And then that's entirely where it is between the holiday makers and the kind of local fishermen who inhabit this island where they all go on holiday. Is speaking essentially. Those who are verbal and those who are non-verbal.
Yeah, because he often when he first meets the family, the kind of wealthy aristocratic family, he's completely mute in front of their idiotic babbling, and he's good there because he kind of exaggerates. This kind of they are more articulate, those characters, but they talk absolute waffle.
It's so
nonsense.
well lit as well. It's crazy.
Beautifully lit. It's amazing because
it's all reflectors as well.
Is it? Yeah. It's incredible. I mean, it's incredible. It's his most like bright and beautiful, almost because it is Proustian. It's like I think intentionally set in 1910. You can't fail to make these kind of like these links with Proust, who is referenced invoked in Concom, and the. These kind of aristocratic people kind of babble. The husband Andre is a marvelous character. He's got this humped
incredible stoop
back. He's got like a little hump back, and he kind of it's this way of talking like this, which is completely. You think he's doing a bit, but he just persists with this bizarre sing-song kind of flim-flammy accent throughout the whole film.
But meanwhile, Crazy Juby just dials it way too far up. She goes so panto.
She pushes it, doesn't she?
She really ruins every scene she's in.
Yeah, she really does. It's a shame because she's not in it for the first half an hour or so, and it's great. And I was like, maybe I got it wrong, and Juliette Binoche isn't in this film. And then she rocks up, like a panto dame. But she doesn't get it. She's trying to do what...
Exactly. She's just not on the wavelength whatsoever.
No.
Speaking of this idea of articulacy, I'm going to read an extract of Humanity, the screenplay for Humanity.
Yeah.
Which is it's written in French, so this is a Google Translate. But it gives you some idea of like screenplays are a set of I always think a set of IKEA instructions for a film. They are not writing. They are not the film, but they are the instructions, the means by which to make a film. So this is the scene where he's in the car. He having seen the dead body of the girl, and he switches on the radio. In the Citroen, a beeping sound came from the handset, lost in the shadow of the floor. A small blue light was flashing there. It went on for a while like that, without anything being changed. Then a hand came in, pale, parted and outstretched, picking up the hook. He quickly said that everything was fine, that it was not long. Sitting down, he looked where he came from. Later, muttering, he pulled himself together and applied his mind to thinking as the whole sweating body was released. There was in the melody of the air played on the harpsichord, its rhythm, its harmony, a transport, a joy, so lively that they increased its power to act. Pharaon's smile was so awkward, there in the culmination of his flesh, that he saw the simple beauty of a gracious heart, and at that moment the discomfort of the parting body, and all of this visible. Pharaon took some time to meet. His two fingers had gripped the radio button the entire time there had been a coincidence of air and emotion. He had played and squeezed out all the juice. All this cinema he was making, putting himself in this state, this disastrous overflow, he had enjoyed his grief. A face made magnificent on the arpeggios, the lively cadence, head thrown back, torso protruding, legs bent, pain offered, the invention of a theatre so intimate that he cried.
Oh my God!
Somebody
needs to publish these. They've been published in France, you know.
They must have been.
They were both of them,
but in French.
But
it has to be said that there are certain weird elements of like accidental poetry that occur when you put something through Google Translate.
Yeah,
I think certain phrases there do feel a bit unfamiliar, but there is clearly an attempt to capture something that is absolutely there in the film. That one would not necessarily imagine. I mean, when I tried to imagine as an exercise what that scene would look like in screenplay format, I wrote it in traditional screenplay format as just quite a short set of physical instructions. But what he writes there is is capacious of the end product.
Well, it's like Alexei German's ones as well, right? Which is his wife wrote.
Yeah,
and they're quite similar and basically suggestive of a mood.
Yeah. More literary than the final product itself is, perhaps.
Yeah, and there's an inefficiency to this that I really admire. Because I think anybody involved in filmmaking to some measure should be, especially if he boasts about staying within budget, but they should be wasting somebody's money or somebody's time, Yeah. At some point along the way.
I mean, there's what he's doing there is, like you said, your trajectory for it was to write as a series of physical instructions.
Yeah.
He's writing from the inside out. He's writing from the interior and its expression in an ungainly way through the body. And that's something we were talking about the other day on WhatsApp when we were saying that his characters seem to wear their bodies awkwardly. They're it feels like a trembling, congealed mass of the soul or spirit around which this body is draped, and these bodies are now set out on these different motions, and they have to go and live in the world, and they're incompletely tutored to do it. These, one thing you can say about kitchen sink dramas is the naturalism and the easiness of how people do things. Nothing is easy for people in this world. It's the tics, the awkward walks, even the physical comedy, which is Tati-esque and slapstick, but it's part of the fact that these people are kind of bouncing around.
But there's nothing typical, unlike a lot of Tati's best humour comes from the typicality of a movement.
You see it setting up.
Yeah,
you see that, whereas here it's like, again, it's through weird repetitions. People don't learn from their behaviours. Like Fred in Le VIE De Jesus continually falling off his bike. So he's constantly got some sort of unhealed scar or kind of wound on his back somewhere, because he just, every time he tries to slow down on his motorbike, he just falls off and crashes.
It's a kind of transcendence to imperfection.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
and then you can connect that to the corpulent
chef, chief
in Slack Bay, kind of continually. He can't walk more than 6 steps without falling over.
It's so.
And then we realise he's not fat; he's filled with helium.
Yeah, because you can hear
that's
it.
The great revelation of this
balloons.
is that obesity doesn't exist. It's just inflation.
Mentality.
Yeah. After all,
just stop eating.
Because it's good. Like the first time he does it, it's so inelegant, but attains a kind of gracefulness when he they're walking down the slope to where they believe somebody's gone missing and they found some spectacles, and he kind of goes, I might slip down this, and then he kind of lays down almost and rolls down. It's somewhere between really over choreographed and completely accidental,
right?
And in the physical comedy is so much better, because in the way he kind of seems to accept, he almost seems to cause it to happen, and so you're like, is he doing this on purpose? So people's motivations are always really unclear. The way Danny, for example, keeps running into doors.
Danny,
in Concom, like the kind of retard brother who's come back from an institution, who we're led to believe, kind of incorrectly, I suppose, might be the murderer, which is completely absurd. Continually runs into the barn door. It's incredible because it keeps happening in these repetitions.
The sex?
We haven't spoken about
that. Is one thing on our list.
That's
so
early.
I think actually, if we were looking before to locate the moment of uncanniness in his first film, I think it would be in those scenes.
The kind of rutting.
The rutting, exactly.
Yeah. Which in a way, he says in an interview that his sex is not realistic.
Yeah.
But I find it to be actually one of the more kind of blunt and
it's pumping
and kind of like, I mean, we don't want to get into our own personal proclivities, but I think that is like more similar to what sex is like than, say, how David Lynch portrays it.
It's not beautiful.
It's kind of like you understand a certain like just a like fleshiness and a kind of repetition,
and that's why Flanders for me kind of exaggerates this particular trope. I don't mean the scene at war. I mean the ones in the field beforehand.
I thought they were quite beautiful.
But they're
if you watch them in succession after having seen the first two, it begins to end with 29 palms in between. It's sort of,
But that's his approach.
True, but they fall by the wayside in the comic works, I think.
Yeah, there's not really any sex in his later works. I mean, I think the VIE De Jesus, there's that particular scene where they go in.
But that's like saying there's no sex in Tati. I mean,
There's loads, all sex, mate. But they, you know,
Every
they
time
drop.
someone pushes a button, or,
Exactly. The libido
That's
is
the
the
male
libido is
clitoris.
sublimated.
it's things, isn't it? Yeah.
But they go out to they ride out to that field to go and have sex, and it's very kind of almost mechanical until you see this enormous explosion of energy where he kind of uses her like a sock puppet almost.
There's actually no sex in Dumont after his comic
But he starts
like in
working
France,
with.
there's no sex.
He starts working with people with learning disabilities and
why,
professional
why,
actors.
why is that?
You know, that's why.
Discourse, no
Too good to
discourse.
people that you probably can't do that with. I mean, come on, imagine the release form. You'd have to get the day censor to sign off to go. By the way, can we get
form?
can we get Danny to like dip down in the bar? I think, come on. But like, no, there is. I think one thing we talked about in the other episode, his treatment of the body violence and sex are often quite, they're uncannily real. You know, in Humanité, it's when the body's discovered, and there's that kind of the origin of the world, kind of
maggots,
maggots paint of like the vulva and the legs in the hedge.
It's not sexy, but it's not sexy.
That's one of the less subtle art historical references, but they're all over the shop. You know,
They're all over the
like
shop.
the
These Pissarro-esque
particularly
landscapes
Corot,
and shit.
yeah.
I mean, must say as well that like one thing we haven't really talked about is while he's undergoing this comic turn, I think we have established enough that there are real continuities and persisting kind of motifs across all his films. So the comic films are just an intensification of what he was doing.
Well, they're
before.
like problems he hasn't solved yet. He needs to return to, or ID physics or something. You know.
But he has very interestingly adapted his. Yeah, and that's I suppose why. I mean, we haven't really referred to Twin Peaks, although there's not much to say except we very interestingly think Twin Peaks is not as good as the sequel to Con.
That is if you take one take.
That is the cool
That's it.
move
All
to
this
take.
verbiage. That is it. All right.
Twin Peaks, the event series number 3 is good, but it's no Con and the Extra Humans.
You need a bon
in
mot
terms
to
of
distinguish yourself at your next.
in terms of
Jamboree, this is your one. Okay.
they will be loving. They'll be all over you like flies.
Can we talk about musicals for a quick moment?
Let's talk about
Jeanette is a
music in
musical. It's a
general.
rock
actually.
opera.
Music
First
in
of all.
general in his film.
Yeah. The music in
Because-
France is so melodramatic, but I kind of love it. But it's very atypical.
Well, because there's none in the early stuff apart from
Apart
the
from the
non-diegetic,
diegetic
sounds,
which
a
would
little bit of radio here and there.
But then you have, for me, one of the most extraordinary scenes in the first series, Lil Kun Kun, is this kind of young farmer
'Cause
style.
I knew.
We'll pump it in at the
There's
end
a
of this
teenage
episode.
girl that has this song she sings.
But
in
it's
English.
extraordinary because the switch up there is
It's pop.
not only is the song itself like a certified banger, which went on to be, I think, on the French charts and like
Yeah.
Really?
sold loads. But
It felt really familiar,
It's on
but I didn't
Spotify
know.
as
yeah,
like
well, the
a-
familiarity is
But it's not-
amazing.
I
It could
thought
be
it was just-
Natasha Bedingfield or like.
Yeah,
I thought
something,
it was her doing a already existing song.
But no, it
it's not.
doesn't. It was
so
invented with the
it's composed
series.
for that. And then, so anyway, this girl sings this, and they're all, these horrible little juvenile tykes. They're momentarily softened, and everybody is everybody's kind of affected by this, and for a series of close-ups, and then.
They bully the shit out of
Then they bully the shit out of her by singing. Yeah, exactly. And that's I love this pathos.
Amazing. That is so good.
It is because it speaks to, again, the reality is often like people aren't just these weird mannequins. They're quite actual things that little kids do, and the kind of cruelties that little kids are can subject to each other, the casual bullying, one of the things he does really well is children in his films, and obviously he made a film almost entirely with children, in terms of Jeanette, or many more child actors. Is that they are a source, obviously, for kind of innocence for him. They're, as it were, uncorrupted by the adult world, or they can see the absurdities of the adult world for what they are, I suppose, and they're kind of like our litmus test for kind of what's going on. So I guess in general, holy fools are in his films. Like Farion is kind of like that as well, because he's he has this weird three wheels on this weird relationship with this girl he kind of fancies and her boyfriend, and he kind of, they kind of patronize him a bit, and they're a bit more normal, I suppose.
Even though one of them is actually murdering
kids,
young girls.
Yeah. But on the surface, they're a bit more normal, and he's kind of this quite affected, innocent in this world, and there are a lot of these innocents, and sometimes.
But he's also a peeping Tom. He walks in and watches.
Oh
them
yeah,
fight.
he's an oddball. That's what I mean. But he's kind of that's part of his kind of innocence in a way. Is that he is these characters, Con, they always happen to manage to be there at the heart of the action, with the cows being airlifted.
It's quite funny that Dumont said in the interview that he initially scripted that Farion would fuck her when she offers herself, and the actor.
He's disgusted by it.
The actor says, or no, because my wife wouldn't let me. So the reason that he doesn't actually, which I think is a very good creative choice for him to refuse her advances. He says no, not like that.
Not like that, yeah.
Because she wants to situate as top or bottom, and we know he's on the brutal edge of the continuum. But no, he is actually. So
you think he's a brutal
accommodates
bottom?
Himself.
He's more of a brutal
to the needs of his actors, but he also is insistent at certain points on what he wants to achieve. So, and for instance, one of these would be now that he's started to work with actors. I can't remember where I read it, but there was some disquiet in Slack Bay that one of the actors, I think Andre, this kind of silly foppish hunchback, was not getting the number of close-ups that he had expected, because I don't know this guy, but maybe he's a thing in French film. But that refusal, I think, is quite interesting. That you have to share as much screen time with this guy that I met in a chip shop in Normandy, who will never be in another film again.
That's the kind of I think that's his hesitancy about working with actors, because he said, I can't direct them, and I guess that's evident of it, because they know the norms of the film industry, and they can come with a contract about how they want to be shot and what they will and won't do, whereas I think his actual process of working
the
with
discourse
actors,
you take would be that he's not able to sculpt them accordingly, but then that for me is, there's a number of reasons that this is a pea-brained way of relating to these films, but one would be that is just essentially a bien passant liberal assumption that these people don't have autonomy. That they're not themselves. That the only people, like Juliette Binoche, is the only person who would be able to, resist sculpture.
And in fact, like we've said, she's the one thing that she does. She kind of ruins Slack Bay because she brings all her she brings acting to it rather than a kind of openness and naturalism to, and like you said earlier, he works through multiple takes. I think someone like Juliette Binoche would probably become quite frustrated with that.
But he works this line very cleverly, in contrast to say Roma. Roma and Dumont are both in a way philosophers. Dumont literally taught philosophy, but they're both very articulate thinkers who are analyzing the world constantly. Dumont rides this line extremely well in terms of siding with the inarticulate and expressing ambiguity from a sort of non-privileged position, I suppose. I hate that framing, but the ambiguity it expresses it feels very naive and organic rather than and so whereas Roma, for instance, channels all of his mega thoughts and obsessions and desires and narratives of himself into the characters. All the characters in Roma constantly tell you that who they're falling in love with, who they're not falling in love with, and so on and so forth.
But they're interesting ones to consider together, because they both achieve a lens onto the ineffable by way of the entirely ordinary. I was gonna say that they are less Parisian than many other French filmmakers, but perhaps that's not. I'm thinking specifically of these kind of Roma ones, which are in boring market towns, like My Boyfriend's Girlfriend, or these sorts of films.
But they're metropolitan people.
Green Ray, absolutely. People who've gone to the countryside.
Chatty people like us who talk about our feelings.
I think they're almost complementary, actually, in some ways.
Roma and
Dumont.
Yeah, I could see that. There's a similar kind of nothingness about
although the police procedural aspect, that's more Chabrolian in its way, but
Yeah, I mean, talking about process, one of the interesting things is with, say, Life of Jesus, is how he kind of introduces immanence through his films. Is that so it goes? He obviously cast Freddie from like literally knocking on his door. The bearing of the title of the film, The Life of Jesus, to the actual film fabula of the film itself, there's nothing. But that was the first thing he told Freddie. He said the film is called that, and he wanted to lodge that idea in his head. So that is swimming around in Fred's
That's true.
head.
That's the one clear spiritual aspect. I completely mistook that when I was like, what's the main spiritual aspect of the life of Jesus? Oh, the title.
Yeah.
And he lent that from a book, which was a kind of denaturalizing attempt to historicize the figure of Jesus.
So that book is it's the life of Jesus without any of the miracles and the divine, I believe. I think that's how it goes.
Okay.
It's just as if Jesus' life was extracted, all of the kind
Except
of
the
divine
sexy bit where they look at the sky.
Yeah, and that's all you get. You get that little bit of, you get a bit of thigh, basically, thigh or sky. But he lodged that idea in his head. He also gives actors he never gives them the whole script. He gives them scene by scene, so they don't have a picture of the whole.
Love it.
Which is great. Which is what generates this kind of
conceal and
fragmentary,
shoots in order as well. This is another model of inefficiency that I can really get behind.
That goes hand in hand with, like, if you're giving people a scene at a time, you have to shoot in order. You can't like flip around, which is why I think sometimes characters visibly change over the film. I think say with Slack Bay, Andre, the kind of hunchback father, his I know I said earlier, his mannerisms do drop off slightly. He does become a bit more normal as the film proceeds. So he hits it very hard in the first few scenes and then becomes a bit more normal. And then in the finale, he embraces the policeman. And they have this almost homoerotic moment, the chef, when he comes down from the sky.
True.
And that you almost believe that they're going to kiss.
Yeah.
It's remarkable.
On that note, we have completed an hour of Dumont chat.
Yeah.
Are there any final words? And what would you say a Dumont virgin should break the seal with,
George?
I'd say Little Cum for sure, actually. And then you can work your way backwards and forwards accordingly. But especially the culmination of the series, which is this great round dance in which all of the characters we've met, including those who've been eaten up by cows and destroyed in various, like, increasingly macabre ways, are reunited. I suppose it's slightly reminiscent of the Seventh Seal, the final dance up on the mountainside.
Oh, very
the dance macabre, literally.
Yeah, exactly. But we also get Ferron from L'Humanité Returns.
That's very true.
And he's in the garb of the asylum where he lives. And the whole thing is just this most, like, phenomenal eruption that really does seal the deal that this is an ongoing work into which, and he's a filmmaker about which you can say, even when he's fallen off, as I think maybe he did a little bit with France, that you remain apprehensive, you remain curious about where his continuing output will take him,
And I am interested where he goes from France, because I think in many ways France, people will, when it eventually comes out in British cinemas this year, it will get a new audience of people who've never seen Dumont, so by default it will be the first Dumont film many people have seen. And it's just an art house, it's a ready-made art house classic.
It's a square, an Austen
exactly
film,
and it plays, like sort of like Succession or something. It's very gripping, but it does I mean, I would say either start with France, because that's sort of available and that's very accessible, and if you find that little weirdness and intrigue enticing, then go back to the start. But I think
need to get to a point where you can enjoy Heiderwich, which will take. You have to go through all the others and
whole series of cold baths.
Do you think that's the sort of, not Horse Satan?
No, that's the moment of greatest kind of frigidities, like the cold bath.
I think for me,
I would say La Vie de Jesus. I think if I was being serious, people should probably start at the beginning.
I think people will be less confounded, because Horse Satan is probably his most enigmatic film. I should think it borrows the language of L'Humanité in a lot of ways, but because it has no driving centrifugal force. It's really just a series of stuff that happens
Just
with
people
this.
walking around in fields and getting shot. Yes.
Yeah, getting langed up.
That's all Dumont is. Just
Yeah,
people walking
pretty
around in
much.
fields.
But I think for that for me is the
License people running
apotheosis
with,
of Dumont's kind of approach, and I think that's not sustainable for him to make Hors Satan again and again and again. I'm glad he didn't, because it kind of stands out for its insane imminence, and is more imminent than any of his other films, and it's probably, perhaps too much even, which is why some people I think don't like it or find it a little bit too baffling.
Certainly baffling.
But the only other thing I can say is l'Apocalypse.
Apocalypse.
Carpentier. All right. Take care, listeners.
Au revoir.
See you soon.